Every morning at 6, she made the bed before her husband woke. Not because he asked, because if she didn't, the whole day fell apart. In 1955, being a housewife meant living by rules nobody ever wrote down. These are those rules, and number 12 is the one nobody talks about, even now. Over the next quarter hour, we'll uncover all 25 of these secret rules, passed down through generations but rarely spoken aloud. Stick around until the end, because the final rule might be the most surprising of all. The first rule: the bed was made before 6, before her husband ever woke. It wasn't about neatness, it was about order. A made bed signaled that the day was under control, that she was ready for whatever came next. But why did such rules matter so deeply? And why did so many of them vanish? As we go through these rules, we'll see how each one slowly faded, edged out by convenience, by changing social norms, or simply by being seen as old-fashioned. But for a generation of women, these rules were the invisible frame of daily life. Number 1. The bed was made before 6, before her husband ever woke. She slid out of bed, tucked in sheets, smoothed the quilt, all in near darkness. This wasn't tidiness, it was respect. A made bed meant the household ran on order, not chaos. By the 1960s, this habit faded as more women worked morning shifts. Convenience replaced ritual. A rumpled bed was no longer a moral failing. Why did it vanish? Because the 1950s ideal of the homemaker gave way to the working woman. Making a bed before dawn lost its urgency when a woman had to catch a bus for a factory job. By the 1970s, it seemed old-fashioned, a relic of a time when a wife's first duty was to present a spotless home. The quiet order of a made bed simply fell out of fashion. In 1954, Margaret Oakes of Des Moines, Iowa, rose at 4:45 a.m. each morning to remake the bed before her husband, a traveling salesman, stirred. She spent $2.75 on a new quilted mattress pad that year, believing a smooth bed meant a smooth day. The rule held because a made bed signaled order, control, and wifely devotion. A silent proof that the home was managed before the world intruded. It faded in the 1960s as women entered the workforce, and the ideal of the pristine housewife gave way to practicality and shared domestic duties. Number 2. Dinner on the table at 6 sharp. No excuses, no exceptions. By 5, the housewife had the roast in the oven, potatoes peeled, and vegetables washed. She set the table with precision, ensuring every fork aligned. This rule faded as women entered the workforce, and convenience foods offered flexibility, making the rigid schedule feel oppressive. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, more women took jobs outside the home. A 6 o'clock dinner required someone home by 5, a luxury few working mothers had. Casseroles and frozen vegetables replaced the elaborate roast. The rule quietly disappeared, a casualty of progress. In 1954, Betty Morrison of Des Moines set her timer for 5:30 p.m. every evening. When her husband arrived at 6:02, she'd already scraped the roast into the trash and served herself a cold sandwich. The silent treatment lasted 3 days. The rule held because a man's job was the family's sole anchor. His punctual meal was a daily tribute to that hierarchy. It faded as women entered the workforce in the 1960s, and frozen TV dinners offered a quiet rebellion. Number 3. Saturday night was bath night, in strict family order. Father went first, for he needed hot water after a week of hard labor. Then the older children. Then the younger ones. Mother went last, sponging in water that had grown tepid and grey. Why did it fade? As indoor plumbing became standard and water heaters affordable, the weekly ritual seemed primitive, even backward. The strict order vanished when hot water flowed on demand, not from a kettle, but from a tap. In 1956, Esther Kowalski of Des Moines, Iowa, would heat water on the stove for her husband Frank's Saturday bath after his shifts at the tractor plant. The water cost 2 cents per gallon, and she budgeted exactly 10 gallons for the family's weekly wash and baths. The rule held because it conserved hot water and reinforced the family hierarchy. The breadwinner's comfort came first. By the mid-1960s, water heaters became standard in new homes, and the ritual quietly dissolved as families bathed at their own convenience. Number 4. The Sunday roast schedule. One big cook, and every weekday's leftover had a name. Tuesday's hash, Wednesday's croquettes, Thursday's stew. It stretched to Sunday chicken across Monday's sandwiches and Friday's soups with hardly a scrap lost. By the 1960s, frozen TV dinners offered a shortcut that didn't require naming your leftovers. The single big cook tradition faded as convenience edged it out, though the thrift it taught is still quietly practiced today. In 1954, Margaret O'Brien of Des Moines stood at her sink, turning Sunday's leftover 89-cent chuck roast into Tuesday's hash. She added a 15-cent can of beets, stretching the meat to feed her family of 5 for 3 more meals, saving nearly $1.20 that week. The rule held because a single roast cost $1.50, a full day's grocery budget, and waste was unthinkable. It faded as 1960s supermarkets offered cheap frozen dinners and two-income families had less time for daily kitchen alchemy, turning necessity into nostalgia. Number 5. The apron came off before he walked in, hair fixed, lipstick on, at the door. It wasn't vanity, it was respect. She'd listen for his car, then in minutes transform from cook to wife. But by the 1960s, as more women entered the workforce and marriages became partnerships of equals, the ritual seemed too theatrical. It wasn't outlawed, it simply felt like performance, and performance fell out of fashion. In 1956, Eleanor Morrison of Des Moines kept a compact in her apron pocket. At 5:12 p.m., hearing her husband's Ford, she'd duck behind the kitchen door, swipe on Tangy Natural, and toss the apron on a hook. Cost, 39 cents. She never missed a day. The rule held because a husband's return marked the boundary between her work and their marriage. By the late 1960s, as women entered offices and Betty Friedan's book sold 3 million copies, the ritual felt less like respect and more like a curtain call. Number 6. Rising an hour before the family, her only quiet hour of the day. While the house still slept, she made coffee, sat in the kitchen window, and gathered herself before the demands began. This quiet hour vanished as alarm clocks and factory whistles made waking early a collective chore, not a private luxury. By the 1960s, the peaceful ritual was edged out by the rush of modern mornings. In 1957, Eleanor Vance of Davenport, Iowa, rose at 5:30 each morning. She brewed coffee in a percolator that cost $4.95. For 47 minutes, she sat by the window mending a single sock or simply watching the streetlight fade. That hour was her only unscheduled time. This rule held because a housewife's day was never her own. Children, meals, and chores consumed every other minute. The quiet hour was a sanctioned pause, a moment to gather herself before giving. It faded as more women entered the workforce in the 1960s, and the luxury of solitude became a necessity of schedule. Number 7. Borrowing sugar had rules. When a neighbor knocked for a cup of sugar, you lent it freely. Part of the unwritten code of mutual aid, but the returned cup had to be heaping full, a gesture of gratitude, and you never returned it the same day. That would imply you resented the loan, that you were keeping score. The rule preserved dignity on both sides. This practice faded as packaged goods and supermarkets made scarcity less common. By the 1960s, borrowing sugar felt old-fashioned, even low-class. The unwritten rule-books were quietly shelved. Convenience replaced community, and the heaping cup of sugar became a memory. In 1957, Dorothy Miller of Elm Street, Wichita, borrowed a cup of sugar from her neighbor Betty. She returned it the next day in a glass jar tied with a red ribbon, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you, Betty." 1 cup returned with interest, 2 cookies. The jar sat on Betty's counter for weeks, a small emblem of trust. This rule held because sugar was a staple, and borrowing built a web of daily reliance, a silent promise that you'd never be without. It faded as supermarkets stayed open later, cars became common, and women entered the workforce. By the mid-1960s, a neighbor's knock for sugar felt like an intrusion, not a connection. Number 8. The coffee klatch, where the real news of the neighborhood was traded. Every morning, after the breakfast dishes were done, the women gathered in a neighbor's kitchen with a fresh percolator and a plate of cake. They talked about recipes, children, and, quietly, the family whose husband had lost his job. But as more wives entered the workforce in the 60s, the daytime coffee circle dissolved. By the 70s, it seemed old-fashioned, a relic of a slower time. It was more than gossip. It was a safety net. A way to share news of a doctor who took payments on credit, or a grocer who would mark down day-old bread. That system of informal aid faded when supermarkets and televisions made neighbors strangers. The klatch became a memory, whispered about as the way things used to be. In 1956, Margaret Tully of Maple Street would set out her mother's silver-plated coffee urn every Tuesday at 10 a.m. For 35 cents a pound, she bought Folgers from the A&P, and the women would sip from her good china cups while discussing whose son had gotten a C in arithmetic. The rule held because it was the only sanctioned space for women to share frustrations about husbands and budgets without seeming disloyal. By 1963, as more wives took part-time jobs at the new shopping mall, the gatherings thinned. The telephone replaced the kitchen table as the news hub. Number 9. Curtains and front steps were inspected. The street judged a wife by her windows. Before breakfast, a housewife would check her front windows and stoop. Smudges or drooping drapes whispered neglect. Crisp, evenly hung curtains and a swept step signaled order. This faded as dual-income homes left less time for such scrutiny, and neighbors stopped minding. In 1954, Dorothy Miller of 742 Elm Street spent 17 cents on a new bottle of Windex after Mrs. Peterson across the way commented on a smudge. She scrubbed her panes twice weekly, even in January's frost, knowing the street's eyes were on her. The rule held because a woman's worth was tied to her home's face. Clean windows signaled order, morality. It faded as women entered the workforce in the 1960s, and suburban privacy grew. By 1970, fewer cared about the glint of glass. Number 10. Never outshine the hostess. You brought a dish, but never a better one. A casserole with a modest topping. A jello mold that colored but didn't dazzle. The hostess's turkey was the star. Today, the rule seems quaint. Why bring anything less than your best? But back then, it was about preserving harmony. As women's roles changed, the wisdom of small self-effacements faded, edged out by a culture that celebrates individual display. In 1955, Betty Larson brought a glazed ham to Marjorie Sims's bridge luncheon. The ham cost $4.30 and glistened with pineapple rings. Marjorie's tuna casserole sat untouched. Betty never received another invitation from that circle. The rule preserved a fragile hierarchy where a hostess's worth was measured by her spread. By the mid-1960s, convenience foods and working wives blurred these lines. A store-bought pie no longer signaled disrespect, and the unwritten code quietly dissolved into memory. Number 11. What happened in a marriage stayed behind the front door. A husband's temper, a wife's disappointment, a child's misstep. None of it crossed the threshold. The porch was a boundary. Outside, you were a united front. Inside, you settled it quietly. This rule faded as couples began seeing marital strife as a matter for counseling, or eventually public airing. The old privacy started to feel like shame. Before the 1960s, few people discussed private troubles outside the home. It was seen as airing dirty laundry. But as marriage counseling gained acceptance and self-help books grew popular, keeping secrets lost its virtue. Today, we call that silence suppression. But in the 50s, it was called loyalty. In 1954, Eleanor Baxter of 742 Maple Drive spent $3.78 on a new lipstick to hide the bruise on her jaw. She told the druggist she'd slipped on the ice. The neighbor who saw her husband's car in the driveway at noon said nothing. The rule held because a woman's reputation was her currency, and a broken home devalued it. By 1963, Betty Friedan's book sold 3 million copies, and women began whispering in kitchens, then aloud. The front door stayed, but the silence cracked. Number 12. The party line rules. Up to a dozen families shared one telephone line. Anyone could quietly lift the receiver and listen in. So real news traveled in code. The rhubarb is ready meant a birth. Aunt Edna has a cold meant trouble at home. Everyone knew, and nobody ever admitted it. Why it faded? As private lines became affordable in the 1960s, families paid extra for unshared service. The party line lingered in rural areas, but died out as bell system upgrades made it obsolete. By the 1980s, it was a forgotten relic, a secret keeping system that quietly vanished when a phone became private. In 1954, Betty Morrison of 214 Elm Street heard her neighbor, Doris, whisper to her sister about a suspicious lump found in her breast. Betty kept silent, but later slipped a note under Doris's door with the number of a specialist. The party line had saved a life, but also bound them in a silent pact of shared secrets. The rule held because community trust outweighed privacy. A whispered scandal or a doctor's call was safer shared than hidden. By 1962, private lines dropped to $5 a month, and the party line faded. The silence it once held was replaced by the ring of a single, unshared phone and the quiet loss of a neighbor's watchful ear. Number 13. The front parlor was for company only, plastic covers on the sofa, children forbidden. This room was a museum of domestic pride, preserved under clear vinyl to protect the good furniture from wear and tear. Why did it fade? As homes shrank in the 1960s, separate parlors merged into family rooms, and new synthetic fabrics promised easy cleaning. Suddenly, plastic covers felt low class, a symbol of pretension rather than pride. In 1954, Margaret Holloway of Des Moines spent $47 on a floral print sofa, then encased it in clear vinyl. Her daughter Linda once touched the fabric and was sent to her room for an hour. The room smelled of lemon polish and closed windows. The parlor was a stage for social performance, proof that a family could afford unused space. By the mid-1960s, as open-plan living and casual entertaining took hold, the plastic covers came off, and children were allowed to sit on the sofa, a quiet surrender to comfort over display. Number 14. Whipping butter and margarine together. One of you told me your mother did this. Half the price, all the flavor, and nobody at the table ever knew. Margarine cost pennies and tasted thin on its own. A quick whip with real butter fooled every palate, but by the 60s, margarine improved, and thrifty tricks like this fell out of fashion as full butter became affordable again. In 1954, Margaret Tuttle of Des Moines, Iowa, stood at her kitchen counter every Sunday evening, blending 1 stick of butter, costing 29 cents, with 2 sticks of margarine at 15 cents each. She'd whip them together with a wooden spoon until the yellow ribboned through the white, a secret economy she never spoke of aloud. This rule held because a housewife's worth was measured in invisible thrift, stretching a dollar without anyone, especially her husband, noticing the compromise. It faded as margarine shed its wartime stigma and butter became affordable again, but also as the 1960s whispered that a woman's cleverness deserved more than a hidden bowl. Number 15. Clothes had ranks. Sunday best stayed Sunday best and never wore down a rank early. A woman's wardrobe was a hierarchy, the finest dress for church, the second best for visiting, and the faded house dress for scrubbing floors. To wear a Sunday dress on a Tuesday was to waste its dignity. And everyone noticed. Why did the ranks fade? As ready-to-wear clothing became cheap and plentiful, the need to preserve a single good dress vanished. By the 1960s, department stores offered affordable dresses for every day, and the old system of dressing up and down seemed fussy and old-fashioned. Convenience overruled thrift. In 1954, Evelyn Porter, a young mother in Des Moines, owned 3 dresses, one for church, one for visiting, and one for home. Her Sunday dress, a navy crepe with pearl buttons, cost $12.95 at J.C. Penney. She wore it only to services, never to grocery shop, preserving its crispness for the Lord's gaze. The rule held because cloth was expensive and status was fragile. A worn dress whispered poverty. By the mid-1960s, synthetic fabrics and ready-to-wear flooded stores. Prices dropped, and women began wearing the same dress to church and the PTA. The hierarchy dissolved into comfort and personal style. Number 16. Never to the store in curlers. A housewife dressed to be seen, even for groceries. She might pin-curl her hair at night, but in public it was combed, sprayed, and presentable. A scarf or hat covered any remnants, because neighbors talked. By the 1960s, casual errands became acceptable. Hair salons and home permanents made curlers a mourning tool, not a secret. The rule faded as convenience won over appearance, though some grandmothers still never left the house undone. In 1955, Margaret Olson, a mother of 3 in Des Moines, Iowa, was spotted at the A&P with her hair still in pink foam rollers. The checker, Mrs. Hendershot, rang up her 1247 order in silence, but the next day, the Bridge Club whispered. Margaret never went out uncovered again. The rule held because a woman's appearance was her household's public face, a badge of competence and respectability. It faded quietly in the late 1960s as women entered the workforce and casual dress became a small act of rebellion, though some older women still felt a twinge of shame without lipstick. Number 17. The Christmas card list was a ledger of relationships. Each December, a housewife would sit with last year's box and a fine pen, silently weighing who had written first, who had sent a card but never a letter, whose name felt like an obligation and whose like a gift. The list narrowed by a few names each year, quietly dropped, never discussed. Why it faded? As families scattered across the country and holiday newsletters replaced personal notes, the ledger became a chore. By the 1970s, pre-printed labels and generic sentiments edged out the old ritual. The quiet dropping of names felt less like diplomacy and more like neglect. So the tradition itself was quietly dropped too. In 1957, Margaret Whittaker of Des Moines spent $3.50 on a box of 24 embossed cards. She crossed out the name of her neighbor, Helen, after a dispute over a shared fence. The card was never sent, and the rift became permanent. The list measured social debts and affections, a silent map of community. By the late 1960s, cheaper cards and busier lives made the ritual feel archaic. The ledger was replaced by a phone call, then forgotten. Number 18. Children were seen and not heard. The table talk rule. At the dinner table, children spoke only when spoken to. A child who interrupted was sent to the kitchen to finish alone. This rule faded when child development experts argued that conversation at meals builds language skills and family bonds. By the 1970s, the silent table was seen as stifling, not respectful. In 1954, Margaret Hollister of Wichita, Kansas, sent her 7-year-old son Tommy to the kitchen for interrupting her husband's discussion of a 2015 car repair. Tommy stood on a wooden stool facing the wall until the apple pie was served. The rule held because a quiet table signaled a well-run home, a husband's authority unchallenged. By the mid-1960s, as televisions hummed and teenagers questioned, more mothers quietly let children speak, first at breakfast, then slowly at dinner, until the rule dissolved into memory. Number 19. The clean plate rule. You ate what was served, or you ate nothing. A child who refused a meal simply waited until the next one. No snacks, no substitutes. The lesson was gratitude and thrift. Why it faded? The post-war boom brought abundance. Packaged snacks and convenience foods gave children choices. The rule began to feel harsh, even punitive. By the 1970s, experts urged parents to let kids tune in to their own hunger. The clean plate rule, once a badge of discipline, became a relic of leaner times. In 1954, Margaret O'Malley of Des Moines served her family liver and onions for 39 cents a pound. Her son Tommy pushed the plate away. She said nothing, cleared it and gave him no supper. By breakfast, he ate the leftover liver cold without complaint. The rule held because food was scarce in memory. The Depression and war taught that waste was sin. It faded as the 1960s brought convenience foods and prosperity. Parents began offering choices, and pediatricians warned against mealtime battles. The clean plate became a relic of thrift. Number 20. Father was served first, the unbreakable order of the table. The husband didn't just get the first plate, he got the choicest cut, the largest serving, and the best seat. He was the breadwinner, and the table's order made that visible every evening. This order faded as more women entered the workforce after the war. If both parents worked, the old hierarchy seemed less natural. Shared earning brought a more equal table. The practice simply felt outdated and faded away. In 1955, Margaret Holloway of Des Moines, Iowa, spent 47 cents on a sirloin tip roast for Sunday dinner. She carved the meatiest slice for her husband, Frank, a tool and die maker, before portioning for herself and their 3 children. The leftover fat she rendered for soap. The rule held because the husband's wage, averaging $4,000 yearly in 1956, was the family's sole income. Serving him first honored that economic burden. It faded as women entered the workforce in the 1960s. By 1970, 43% of married women worked, and the table's hierarchy quietly loosened. Number 21. Wait till your father gets home. The waiting itself was the punishment, hours of dread, imagining what was coming. Mother held the threat, but deferred the execution. Why did it fade? As parenting advice shifted toward immediate, proportional discipline, the deferred threat came to seem emotionally cruel. By the 1970s, experts urged consistency, not suspense. The waiting, it turned out, was worse than the punishment itself. In 1957, Eleanor Vance of Des Moines, Iowa, spent a whole afternoon darning her husband's argyle socks after he found a nickel she'd borrowed from his change dish. She mended each hole twice, knowing the real reckoning came at 6:15. The rule held because a husband's authority was the final currency in a home where a wife managed the daily accounts but never held the ledger. It faded as women began keeping their own checkbooks, and the waiting room of the kitchen clock lost its power. Number 22, homework at the kitchen table, where she could watch while supper cooked. The mother sat nearby, darning socks or peeling potatoes, her presence a silent assurance that math problems would be finished before the casserole. This ritual fell away as after-school activities multiplied and the television became the household's new hearth. The kitchen table was command central, homework spread on oilcloth, a pot of chili bubbling beyond. She could correct a sloppy cursive letter without rising. By the 1960s, the kitchen table had lost its role as the family nerve center, replaced by rumpus rooms and pre-packaged dinners that nobody had to watch over. In 1957, Eleanor Miller of Des Moines, Iowa, sat with her son Tommy at the Formica table, a pile of arithmetic worksheets between them. She peeled carrots for 39 cents a pound, glancing at his eraser shavings. The oven timer ticked, pork chops sizzled. She didn't correct his sums, just hummed, her needle pulling thread through a sock heel. The rule held because a mother's watchful stillness was thought to build character, her quiet presence a scaffold for discipline. By the late 1960s, as women entered the workforce, the kitchen table emptied. Homework moved to bedrooms, the stove's warmth no longer chaperoned. The rule faded not with a bang, but with the click of a car door. Number 23. Company manners and family manners. Children switched on cue. In many homes, children learned two codes, one for Sunday visitors, another for every day. They could slouch at the family table, but when company came they sat up straight, said please and thank you, and spoke only when spoken to. The switch was instantaneous. A parent's look or a soft cough was enough. This dual standard fell out of fashion as parenting shifted toward authenticity and emotional openness. By the 1970s, many felt it was hypocritical to teach children to act one way at home and another outside. The company manner began to seem old-fashioned, even dishonest. And as families grew smaller and more private, the audience for such performances simply disappeared. In 1954, Eleanor Vance of Des Moines drilled her 3 children before her sister's visit. At 3:30 p.m. she'd say, "Company manners now." They'd sit straight, say please and thank you, and never argue. The transformation cost her 15 minutes of prep, but it was expected. The rule held because a home's order mirrored a woman's worth. By the late 1960s, as women entered the workforce and family life relaxed, the two-code system faded. Children began to be seen as individuals, not props for social approval. Number 24. No complaints at the table. Gratitude was mandatory. A housewife would never allow a negative word about the meal. If a child pushed peas around the plate, she taught them to thank the cook, not criticize the food. Complaining was seen as ungrateful, a sign of poor character. By the 1960s, this rule faded as family dynamics shifted. Books and psychologists began encouraging children to express their preferences, even at the table. The old way felt stifling. Gratitude was replaced by open dialogue. But something was lost. The quiet dignity of not complaining. In 1954, Betty Miller of Des Moines served her family a meatloaf that had burned on the bottom. Her husband, Frank, said nothing, but scraped the blackened bits to the side. Betty spent the next day crying in the kitchen, knowing she had failed the rule of gratitude. The rule held because a housewife's worth was measured by her family's contentment. Complaints were seen as ingratitude for her labor. By the mid-1960s, as women entered the workforce and convenience foods rose, the pressure to perform domestic perfection loosened, and honest feedback at the table became acceptable. Number 25. They never complained, because complaining didn't help. A woman who complained was seen as ungrateful or weak. Instead, she mastered the art of quiet endurance, finding strength in silence. In 1957, Margaret Simmons of Omaha, Nebraska, spent $1.89 on a new ironing board cover, but when her husband asked about the dent in the kitchen linoleum from a dropped skillet, she simply said it must have been there before. She never mentioned the burned fingers or the silent tears. The rule held because a compliant wife kept the household peace and upheld the family's public image. By the mid-1960s, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and the rise of second-wave feminism gave women language to name their discontent, and the quiet endurance began to crack. This quiet stoicism faded as the women's movement gave voice to personal struggles. Today, we value emotional honesty over silent endurance, but we risk losing the memory of those who bore their burdens without a word, unless someone keeps their stories alive. And so, as we look back on these 25 rules, what becomes clear is that they were never about deprivation. They were about order, the kind of order that made a household run smoothly without a paycheck to spare, without safety nets, without anyone else to call. Each rule was a small act of rebellion against chaos, a quiet declaration that dignity could be had even on a shoestring. But the world changed. Frozen dinners replaced the Sunday roast schedule. The party line became a private line, and then a mobile phone. The front parlor turned into a family room. These rules weren't outlawed, they simply fell out of fashion, edged out by convenience, by prosperity, by a desire for more ease. But something was lost in the trade-off, a kind of resourcefulness that leaned on community instead of institutions, on habit instead of money. These memories are disappearing unless someone keeps them. So did your family do any of these? Tell us below, and if you want this wisdom preserved, subscribe so it isn't forgotten. These rules weren't written down. They were passed from mother to daughter, whispered over the coffee klatch, enforced with a look across the dinner table. And though the world has changed, the core truth remains. That a well-ordered life, like a well-ordered kitchen, can weather any storm. The specific rules may have faded, but the habits behind them, thrift, community, foresight, still have the power to anchor us. Before you go, ask yourself what small rule from your own family's past might still serve you today. Share that memory in the comments, and if you believe these stories matter, hit subscribe, because every time we tell them, they live a little longer.